defining a state. Hi, welcome back. Later in the course, we will consider answers to the question, why should we have a state? In thinking about this, we will also be thinking about this question, what should the state look like? What kind of state should we have? What kind of institutions should there be? How should they operate? Answering all of these questions requires having some understanding of the various options, the various choice points that we face. What are some of the choice points that we, or some imagined constitutional designer, might consider? So consider this a brief introduction into the institutional options, the things we might choose to have within our state. At a very basic level, we can think about the source or ultimate foundation of political power. There are a lot of options. So does political power come from a god or gods? That'd be a theocracy. Does it come from the will of a king or a queen? That'd be monarchy. Does it come from the power of an elite group, where that would be oligarchy or aristocracy? Does it come from technical knowledge or expertise? That'd be what's called technocracy. Or, in the last option, does it come from the people in some sense? Is that the source of political power? And that, familiarly, is democracy. One of the most significant developments in the past 2,000 years on the planet is the general move away from versions of theocracy, monarchy, and oligarchy, and toward various forms of democracy. For most of the course, we will assume that some version of democracy is the most morally attractive option, and so the debate will be focused on the details. Within any legal and political system, there are many distinctively legal and political tasks or roles to be performed. So there's the legislative task, the creation of law and policy. There's the executive or enforcement task, the execution and enforcement of laws and policies. And there's the judicial task, the application of general laws to particular cases. Accordingly, there are different ways in which each of these can be carried out. So now let me highlight a few of these different options. So for the legislative task, one option is to have what's called a direct democracy, where all people vote on all issues and proposed laws. As an alternative to this, there's what's called representative democracy, where some subset of people will make law and policy. If we have a subset, if we have representatives, there are further questions. How should we choose them? By election, as is common, or by lottery, as was common in the ancient world? Should they represent a particular geographic district? Or should they represent some other constituency, such as political party, religion, age, or profession? Should we have a single-member district system, where one person is chosen to represent some group, or a multi-member system, where each of us have several different people who are supposed to be representing us? If we have elections, how should they be set up? Should voters vote for candidates directly, or for party platforms? Should all people get a vote? Should all the votes be counted equally, or should some be weighted? Should there be educational requirements, or competence or knowledge tests before one can vote? Should we just vote for one candidate, or should the system take into account our rankings over all of the different candidates? All of these are different options that we'll talk about and have actually been considered and employed in practice in different places. Other questions: how should the legislature itself be structured? Should there be multiple houses of the legislature? If so, based on what? So in the United States, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives, and there's questions about the relationship between those and why one is populated in a certain way and one is populated in a different way. We'll talk some about those options. There are questions about the relationship between the legislature and the other branches of government. So, in particular, should there be an executive veto or not over what the legislature does? Should there be a judicial veto, where we have something like a Supreme Court that can overturn legislation that has been passed by the legislature? There's questions about the scope of the legislature. Should we have a legislature that can create law or policy over anything at all? Or should there be constitutional or other kinds of limitations on what the legislature can do? Some of these limitations might be in place to protect the rights of individuals against the majority. So we might have something like a Bill of Rights that limits what the state can do. Or some of these limitations might be to limit the reach of the federal government as opposed to local governments. So in a federalist system with a central federal government and local states, there's questions about the relationships between those. Should we have a generalist legislature that handles all policy matters, or should we have single-issue legislatures that focus just on one relatively narrow area of law or policy? Should the legislature also be responsible for taxation, figuring out who pays taxes and how much they pay, for setting the national budget? These are all questions that we can ask about the legislature, and we'll talk more in detail about some of them later in the course. We can turn next to thinking about the judicial task. And here again, there are many questions we might ask about how the judicial system should work. So one initial question concerns the judicial power and whether there's a constitution that the judiciary is responsible for interpreting and protecting. A big related question is whether there should be a constitutional or a Supreme Court that has the power to overturn executive decisions or legislative actions on the grounds that those are unconstitutional. So one option is to have a court like the United States Supreme Court that can rule these things unconstitutional directly, invalidating them as law, saying this isn't the law, it's unconstitutional. Another option is to have a court that gives what we might call suggestions or advice to the other branches about how to best interpret the Constitution without overturning anything directly. Turning from the role of the judiciary in interpreting and enforcing the Constitution against the other branches of government, we might ask about the role of the judiciary in interpreting and applying generally written laws to particular people. So in any particular case, there are at least 4 relevant questions about applying a general law to a particular person. So first there's the question, what is the relevant law? Sometimes this is clear. There's a well-written, unambiguous, clearly relevant statute. Sometimes this is messy, so we get something not like a clear statute, but common law, developed over centuries by tradition and by courts making decisions in particular cases. Second question, what are the relevant facts? What actually happened? What evidence is there that supports the conclusion that this happened or that this doesn't happen? Third question, how does the relevant law, the general law, apply to the facts of this particular case? The final question, what should happen to the individuals involved in the case, the particular people, given the conclusions reached to these other 3 questions? So what should the consequences, punishment, fines, compensation, and so on be, if any? So in any legal system, some individual or group of individuals will have to be charged with answering these 4 questions. So we can ask, how should they go about answering these questions in a particular case? And who should be responsible for answering them? These are questions that you have to think about in designing a legal system. So one option is to use legal professionals, appointed or elected judges or judge inquisitors. Another option is to use non-professionals, citizen juries, made up of, for example, randomly selected members of the population. So in many systems, there'll be a mix of the legal professionals and the non-professionals, who are both involved in answering these questions, maybe with different roles. So in the United States, for example, the factual questions are mostly the responsibility of the jury, while the purely legal questions are the responsibility of the legal professionals, so the judge, in some cases the lawyers. In inquisitorial systems, even the fact finder, the person determining the facts, is a political official. So again, these are all choice points that we have in designing a system. Finally, there's the enforcement or the executive task. So how will the laws that are actually enacted be enforced? How will they be given detailed and precise application? And how will other responsibilities of government be carried out? For example, who will be responsible for national security and national defense, for regulation of food, agriculture, the environment, medicine, transportation, infrastructure, and health? So there might be laws or policy passed on these things, but who's going to actually carry out the day-to-day administration? These might all be the responsibility of the legislature in some sense, but in many systems, there's also an executive administration responsible for carrying out the day-to-day component of these tasks. Given this, there are important questions about how this executive or this executive branch will relate to the other political branches. So will the executive be popularly elected, or will they be appointed or chosen by the legislative party in power? Are administrative agencies, if we have such agencies, going to be under the control of the executive, or might they be independent and technocratic? Or, as another alternative, might they be elected and be political in this sense? In addition to these structural questions about the institutions and their roles, there are questions about the political community that we might ask. So first we might think about the size of the political community in terms of geographic size and population. Related issue, might think about the basis of political community. Should we all be members of a political community based on geography, or based on shared values, or culture, or language? Another question we should think about, and we'll talk about in the class, is the rigidity of the political community. How easy is it to enter and exit? Similarly, we might think about the rigidity of the institutional framework. Once we've figured out our answers to all these different questions that we've been talking about, there'll be questions about how easy it should be to alter the institutional structure. There'll be pros and cons, different things we'll consider on each side. And then there are questions about the relationships amongst the different branches and functions of government that we've discussed. So we'll talk about all of these issues in this class. I mentioned them here to give you a taste of the different options and the way in which we do have real choices to make about our political system, about our legal system. Choices that philosophical argument, and in particular moral argument of a certain kind, can help us to make.